back to the program. As promised, I'm joined by Liberal Senator, Victorian Senator James Paterson, now live out of Melbourne. Thanks very much for your company.
Thank you, Peter.
Let's talk about 18C. I saw, were quoted as saying that you think that the numbers are almost there to get this through the Senate, which essentially means if that's the case, then the government, if it gets in behind it at the executive level, obviously has the numbers in the lower house, assuming that no one crosses the floor. Is this a good reason to get on with it and look at some changes to 18C sooner rather than later when Parliament returns?
Well, I think we're very close, Peter, as you say, but I understand the government's view that at this stage they don't have any plans to make any changes. Obviously, I hope to persuade them that it is necessary to make changes, but personally I'm relaxed about the timing, Peter. There are a lot of more urgent priorities that the government has to address. I mean, any re-elected government has to give effect to its election promises as a priority. We've got a lot of bills to do with that. Budget repair is a top priority. But I hope that, with the right process and the right approach, that this is an issue that during this term we can address.
OK, so you don't think it's urgent enough that it has to be a first order of business? I mean, what are we talking here? What kind of time frame are you, as a freewheeling backbencher who speaks your mind, prepared to tolerate from the executive arm of the Liberal Party?
Oh, Peter, I'm not going to be prescriptive about this. I would just like to see it addressed in this term of Parliament. That's my hope. I think there's a lot of approaches that we could look at to do that. My colleague Dean Smith has proposed some kind of parliamentary inquiry into freedom of expression. I think that's one good approach that would focus people's attention on this issue and related issues. But of course, the government has to do things like the Australian Building and Construction Commission, the Registered Organisations Commission as a Victorian, the CFA issue. These are very time-sensitive issues that need to be dealt with first, and budget repair is always a priority. So I understand why the parliamentary schedule has got to focus on those things first.
What are the elements of 18C as a sort of compromise position, if I could put it that way, that you're interested in having removed?
Well, I think one of the reasonable positions that's been put forward is Senator Bob Day's bill, a private senator's bill from the last parliament. He proposed to take out the words offend and insult and leave the words intimidate and humiliate in 18C.
So can I ask, OK, so intimidate and humiliate would be kept, offend and insult would be removed. Why do you think it's necessary to give people the legal right to insult people based on their race?
Well, we've seen a number of court cases that have demonstrated that our ability to freely express our views on political issues, on cultural issues, are being curtailed by this law. Obviously, most famously, a few years ago was the Andrew Bolt case, but I think in some ways a more troubling case is a case that's currently before the courts from the Queensland University of Technology, where some students essentially engaged in a bit of letting off steam on social media, and we've now had up to a 3-year process of investigation and court action. Can I jump
in though, because in those two cases brought together that you refer to, the amendment that you're talking about wouldn't have necessarily struck out both of those cases because they weren't purely confined to that one half of 18C. When you bring those two cases together, they include all parts of 18C. So in a sense, this legislative amendment wouldn't solve those problems.
Well, it's certainly no guarantee, Peter, that's absolutely right, but I think it would be a step in the right direction, which would reduce the risk of cases like this in the future.
But when you say a step...
And I think it would send...
Sorry to jump in, but when you say a step in the right direction, do you mean a step on a journey towards removing the other elements of 18C? Because otherwise it's a step that's an incomplete step and you fall flat on your face, don't you?
Well, personally, Peter, I can't foresee a time in the short or medium term where anything other than a modest compromise bill like this has any prospects of success. There are many communities which have justified concerns about this, and I can't see them signing up to anything other than a modest compromise bill.
I do understand that political reality, and don't get me wrong, I'm not necessarily an opponent of change, entire change, frankly, to 18C as opposed to partial change, but I'm just wondering, just as a sort of matter of logic, if only doing a half-hearted reform of 18C wouldn't have solved the issues that are always cited as a reason to change 18C, that case in Queensland, the Andrew Bolt case, then what's the point? Because you're solving a problem without actually solving the problem.
Well, I think any progress is welcome progress, Peter. I think it would be very foolish of us to say, why would we take an incremental step towards reform when we could take no steps at all towards reform? I mean, in any area of public policy, we will always take, and we should always take, any meaningful step towards a reasonable objective. So I think absolutely this is a reasonable compromise bill, and I think it has prospect for success, and I think that's why it deserves support.
But you understand my point, though. If you need to have laws that prescribe a certain way to drive a car, and if there are two ways that you can change that, one solves the problem of accidents, the other goes part way towards hopefully making things better, but actually there is no evidence that it solves the problem based on the evidence before us. What's the point in doing the second change? You've got to either do the whole thing or you might as well just leave it alone and get on with other business.
Well, Peter, it's all about reducing the risk of cases like this in the future. I don't think there's any way we can guarantee that there'll be no cases like this in the future, but we can ensure that they are less likely to occur, and that if they do occur, that they're less likely to succeed. I think that's a reasonable, realistic assessment of where we are.
All right, let's move to another issue. I want to ask you about the unemployment rate. We're going to hear later in the program from Scott Morrison about it, as well as obviously wider issues. He no doubt has concerns about Bill Shorten saying no to a whole plethora of billions of dollars worth of savings that they'd previously said that they had an open mind about. But I want to ask you specifically about the unemployment rate. It has come down, not substantially, but by 0.1%. But it's actually bad news, isn't it? Not good news, because there's been an increase in the number of part-time jobs, but there's actually been a decrease in the number of full-time jobs. And that just tells us that the economy's weak, doesn't it?
Well, Peter, I think we shouldn't take too much from any one month-on-month result. I think we need to look over the totality of a couple of months' result, and we can draw a reasonable inference from that.
We should probably just be glad that the ABS have gotten this data to us without being hacked and on time.
Very droll, Peter, very droll. But in the last 12 months, for example, there's been 225,000 jobs created. That is a really positive thing, particularly in a global economic climate which is far from booming. Australia's record of job creation is actually very strong. Of course, we would always like to create more jobs. Of course, we'd always like the unemployment rate to be lower. But I think we should recognise that what has been achieved over the last 3 years, particularly in the last 12 months, is a really meaningful achievement.
Short, though, of what Tony Abbott promised when he said 1 million new jobs from opposition.
Well, I haven't tallied up the figures, Peter, so I can't tell you exactly where we're up to against that goal.
I'm willing to bet someone at
making
Liberal
good
HQ
progress.
would have tallied up the figures, though, if they reached 1 million. Let's be frank about this. They would have been, not that you're somebody that sticks to talking points, that's not what I'm suggesting, but they would have been in talking points during the election if they had tallied up to the 1 million figure, surely.
Well, as I said, Peter, I haven't sat down and crunched the figures, so I can't tell you for sure either way. But there has been positive job creation. That is a good thing. There's clearly more work to do. No one would disagree with that. We want to get the unemployment rate lower, and I think some of the legislative priorities we've got in this term will help address that, particularly the Australian Building and Construction Commission bill. The construction industry is a really important part of our economy, and if we can get that firing again by getting corruption and intimidation out of it, then that would be a really positive step.
One final question. It's got to be frustrating, doesn't it? It certainly is for me, that you can have a scenario where oppositions, and in fairness, you know, at various points in time when the coalition was in opposition, it too did a version of this, but where oppositions say one thing and then do another because they see the obstructionist value in taking on the government. And what I'm really particularly focusing on here is Bill Shorten. He's not going to support savings that he had previously suggested he was interested in. But now that you guys are back in government, he wants to make life hard because it looks more chaotic and it makes it more difficult for you guys to try and balance the books. What can we do about that? Because it does seem like opposition leaders, and I stress again, any opposition leader, they get rewarded for that kind of obstructionism rather than voters really hold them to account for trying to play a deliberate wrecking game.
Well, Peter, not to be too partisan about this, but I can't remember a time when the coalition, having lost an election, an incoming Labor government tried to legislate our election promises and we opposed them. I mean, we are trying to legislate Bill Shorten's election promises.
The ETS would be one, though, wouldn't it? That'd be, I mean, I don't want to get into too much ancient history here, but the ETS that Kevin Rudd proposed was almost directly correlated with the ETS that John Howard proposed in government, and that's why Malcolm Turnbull supported it in his first incarnation as leader, because he was the Environment Minister that crafted it under John Howard. But then Malcolm Turnbull got rolled by his own colleagues when he tried to support Kevin Rudd's very similar ETS.
Well, I think that's quite an exceptional change here. This is not a question of 1 minute before the election and 1 minute after the election having different positions under the same leader. I mean, the Liberal Party had a genuine change of heart on that issue, a real debate, internal philosophical debate about that, and came to a different view. That's clearly not the case of what has happened here by the Labor Party. They made promises prior to the election. We are now trying to legislate them to get the budget back into balance, $6.5 billion worth of savings, and they are indicating that they're not likely to support it. I mean, that is just shameless. How can we put stock in anything they say prior to an election if this is how they behave after it?
All right, James Paterson, we always appreciate your company on Newsday. Thanks very much for joining us once again.
Cheers, Peter.
As Liberal Senator for Victoria, James Paterson. Let's move on to some overseas news. We're going to hear